Well, howdy everyone. We're not normally live on Saturdays, but we had this wonderful opportunity because Billy Hoekman, for those of you who don't know him, he is, I don't know your title. He's a bigwig in Green Juju because there's only two people in the company. So
That was a great intro. I don't know your title, and he's a bigwig because there's only two people.
It's a great company. We love it. What is your title?
Vice President of Nutrition and Communication.
There you go. See, anyway.
There you go.
But Billy was in the area visiting some pet stores to talk about his products and educate employees. And I guess, did you do client events as well?
Yeah, I did I did a Q&A event here at All Pets Considered, which we did not too long ago. Yep. And so I love that part. I can't believe that it just means a lot. There's so many people who are interested in nutrition and want to come out for a night and just learn. And so I always enjoy getting to different parts of the country and doing those sorts of things. So
since he was here, he said, "Hey, I'm coming over." I
always worm my way onto the farm. It's amazing.
So we've had Billy as a house guest, and he's missing his family. So instead of staying until tomorrow, he's going home today, but that's okay. So for those of you who are not aware, today is World Cancer Day. Not pet cancer, just Cancer Day. But we do know that we see so much cancer in our pets, and right now we happen to have a kitty cat with a squamous cell carcinoma under his tongue. So we are dealing with a cancer pet at the moment. We definitely see more cancer in dogs than we do in cats. And the rate of cancer that we see in dogs is much higher than what we see in people. So I think that we seriously need to be addressing, what are we doing wrong?
I think I saw a statistic that was like, it was more than 1 in 2 now.
Oh yeah.
And so, it's basically, unfortunately for most pet owners, it's almost a foregone conclusion that at some point you'll deal with cancer.
Yeah. I think the stat for dogs over 10 years old is like 1.6 out of every 2.
Yeah, it's just wild.
It is crazy. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons behind that. Certainly over-vaccination, throwing pesticides in and on our animals, feeding them the wrong diet, which you've got a couple of nutrition nerds sitting here. So diet definitely plays into it, but then just our environment, GMOs, glyphosate.
And I think the one that people talk about less too is just genetics.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even mean, the only thing that really gets talked about in genetics with dogs and cats, or with dogs specifically, is like purebred versus mixed breed. But all of them are at a genetic disadvantage. It doesn't matter because, one of the things I talk about a lot is, what your mother eating while she's pregnant being so important to the makeup of not only you, but your genes and your gene expression. And so it's a little bit scary when we look back at how many generations of dogs have not been fed correctly.
Yeah, a lot
now. Just a interesting thing about that would be, we know in children, for example, kids whose mother take cod liver oil during pregnancy have higher IQs. And that is because, 10% of your brain is DHA, and that's an essential fatty acid, meaning your body can't make it. And so if you don't get enough of that essential fatty acid, then it just can't transfer to your child. And I think the same thing is true with dogs you could take every respect. And then you have malnourished dog that gives birth to a malnourished dog that gives birth in how many generations, and you end up where we are today, in some respects.
Where it's a mess.
Yes.
I wonder how that plays into the difference between cancer rates in cats versus cancer rates in dogs. The last cat we lost was a 21-year-old with lung cancer, which made it to 21. So that was pretty good. But we do feed cats differently. I mean, they are on, unless you're feeding dry kibble. I guess a lot of people are feeding dry kibble. But my cats have always eaten either raw or a high moisture diet.
I was actually thinking that when you said that, I was thinking to myself, Well, I wonder why that is. And I was thinking maybe it is just, I mean, cats are much more likely to get moisture rich food, even if you're feeding food that's not super high quality.
Yeah. I think a
You're
lot
still
of people
getting
do
cans.
give some canned food.
Yeah, and that does make a big difference because moisture, is the delivery system of nutrients. And so if you have a diet that's completely void of moisture, because you have a lot of dogs, especially in the past 50 years, who maybe they only get dry food and then, biscuits or something like that as a
Yep.
treat. Maybe that's a part of it. And also those foods are probably traditionally, because we're not looking at a big sample of great quality foods obviously in the last 100 years, even though those cans were made up of some not great sourcing and ingredients, they were probably more bioavailable and diversified than
Well, and
the kibble.
cats in general get more fish in their diet, which is giving them more omega-3. And one of the things that we know is limited in like a dry kibble diet for all the animals, but particularly for our dogs, we're using confinement raised meat parts, and we're using like not great parts, and we know that the omega-6 to 3 ratio is completely wrong in most of the food. So we want that to be really low. We'd like it to be 6 to 1, omega-6 to 3 or less. And what's AFCO? It says 30 to 1.
30 or 32 to 1 is the, and that's just based on, because pet foods are typically made with grains, which are much, much higher.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's definitely it's always interesting when you get into like the inner circles of kind of just nutrition generally. There's definitely some debate. I would say anywhere from like 6 to 8 to 1. But that's why, here's my first plug. That's why when you have products like you're looking to around you, that sourcing matters.
Yeah.
And sourcing, because it's the difference between, say, if you're using grass-fed bison, is the difference between an inflammatory diet or not in terms of omega-3 to 6. Although I do sort of want to say, when we talk about omega-3 to 6, we talk about the reality is that omega-6s are inflammatory, but that doesn't mean they're not necessary.
Right.
They just have to, they're as necessary actually as omega-3s. We feed humans and animals, unfortunately, too many of one thing.
Yep.
I don't think there's a lot of research to show, like, I have always wondered, like, would there be ramifications if you did too many omega-3s and almost no omega-6s? I don't know, because it's all part of the healing process. But I don't think anyone's ever, that would be hard.
But I mean, I know like we need the ALA in there, and so we have to have that balance. So I asked you if you would play my game, which is, and I don't want you to lay out a recipe here.
Sure.
But if your dog was diagnosed with cancer, it could be a dog or a cat. Cat would be just a little bit different. But if your pet was diagnosed with cancer, what things would you say, well, I've got to make sure that I get this into my recipe as far as nutrients or whatever? And what things would you say, I'm absolutely not going to feed those to this pet?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. And I also think green juju fits into exactly what I would be recommending in terms of that, because so it really just depends on the approach that you want to take. In terms of, my main focus would be really two things. The first would be when you're looking at the kind of pie chart of your dog's diet. So all of your calories are going to be made up of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. And so when you're looking at diet, whenever you take away one of those things, you have to increase another portion of those. So if we're talking about diets like to also avoid, say, cancer or something like that, you want to obviously lower the carbohydrates as much as possible. So there are always going to be residual carbohydrates. I know this because when we do the nutrition on salmon, and it's only salmon, there are still some residual carbohydrates in that food. It's just a very, very small amount. So the first thing I would do is, if you're looking at say a diagnosis that is sort of very fast moving, and you want to go to that high ketogenic level. You can go as high as like a 4-part 4-part fat to 1-part protein. That's not a sustainable diet forever, really. So then you go down over time in terms of doing that, and that would essentially just be finding a good low carbohydrate diet and then potentially adding some more fat to it. But I think just in reducing the carbohydrates, you can kind of hit that base without worrying too much about is it a 3-to-1, is it a 2-to-1, that aspect of it. And for just general purposes, there's kind of 2 ways you can go about that. So there's a diet that is 1-to-1 fat to protein by calories and 1-to-1 fat to protein by weight. And so if you're doing 1-to-1 by calories, that would be essentially, say you have 5 grams of fat, you'd have 10 grams of protein, because there's 4 calories in a gram of protein and 9 calories in a gram of fat. So that would be the same amount by calories, roughly, and that would be like the low end I would do typically, unless your animal has a sensitivity and you're doing like a single protein rabbit or something like that. Or you do as like a maintenance diet, or even if an animal, had cancer, a 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio by weight. And that just means you'd have 10 grams of protein and 10 grams of fat, which means you're going to have double the fat calories, which when you look at studies where dogs and cats actually pick their calories, and they've done this with wolves too, it is much higher in fat than the average person would think. So I would start there by finding a well-sourced, really great diet that has the right fat profile, has a really low carbohydrate content, and then our green blends, so Just Greens and Bailey's blend, are 3% net carbs. So they're very low in carbohydrates, but they're very, very high in relevant plant antioxidants.
Exactly.
And that is a very, very important part of, we know from I'm like an ADD. So
it's in there.
Oh, I get it. So we know, one of the studies we reference a lot is the Purdue University one, where they were looking at, feeding dogs dark leafy greens 3 times a week, and they were 90% less likely to get bladder cancer in that case. So I think it's our responsibility to, being that it's World Cancer Day, I think it's our responsibility to try to avoid these things. And one of those ways is and we know through the data that we can increase the probability of not dealing with cancer just by doing something simple.
Yeah.
And if you rotate between those 2, you'll be getting a lot of different types of plants. And then you'll also get the bone broth, which is going to sort of support the digestive tract, which is going to help the immune system, which is going to help all of those plants, those antioxidants and the fiber and the vitamins and minerals just be used better in the body. And so that's kind of, Green Juju became a company because those things had such a powerful impact on when Kelly was originally making those products for her dog walking clients, back in Seattle. And so it became a business because she saw the relevant effects of, better digestion, better energy, that aspect of it.
So there's a new diet out, which I'm going to do a rant later in the week, where they're adding a lot of MCT, medium chain triglyceride, as anti-cancer effect.
Okay.
Thoughts?
There's definitely, I guess I'm probably more familiar with the research that goes into like the cognitive stuff with MCT, and we have coconut oil in a lot of our products specifically for that. But I'm also, I like pairing those. So most of the time you're talking about MCT, you're talking about like caprylic acid and capric acid, but people leave out lauric acid. I'm a big proponent of putting those things together because that's how they exist in nature. All of those things are present in all mammals' milk, as far as I know. And so obviously they all have some major health benefits. But one of the things that I look at is like, we use coconut oil for a reason, and that reason is because we want the actual food version of something. And sometimes I think you can medicinize food therapy by isolating ingredients a little too much versus, hey, let's, do these foods. But, I also think it's just more complex than that. A good example would be, our raw goat's milk is the most diverse fat of any food. It has over 400 different fatty acids, all of which do something different. And so for me, it's like, how do I get as many good fats into the diet versus making up? I think you could get into a weird place if you said, like, I'm going to identify 3 fats and make that as the only fats in a diet. Then you become kind of like, better than nature to some degree. So.
Yeah, well, that rant's coming later. I've teamed up with someone else who loves to rant about things dietary as well.
That was my version of a rant. So that's about as high
Billy's
as I
rants
get.
are much calmer than mine. Like we're gonna have to build him a soapbox, but he's already so tall. Our cameras are gonna have to aim up. I don't know if Billy wants to be a soapbox type of person, but he's very.
I'm too Midwestern to grandstand.
See, I'm a Northeasterner. I can get hot under the collar really easy.
Oh, I actually have a funny story about that. I used to go to family gatherings with Jacqueline Hill, and it was an East Coast family, and I had no experience with that. And it would get louder as the night went on, and by the end, everyone's just shouting over each other. And I was like, "This is the exact opposite of where I'm from in the Midwest." So it was always an interesting time.
Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, I think. For our animals with cancer. Now, I'm saying this like ideally, this is what we would do with an animal with cancer. Now, here I am with a cat with a big mama tumor under his tongue, which makes him drool a lot, and he has a really hard time swallowing. And I broke down and bought absolutely the worst can of crap to get him to eat because he needs nutrition. And what I really need to do is go to the store and get some liver and cook it up and throw it in my blender with some other good things, like maybe some goat milk or whatever. But it's, it's sometimes you end up with, I'm going to compromise for right now because I have to. But ideally, again, no starchy carbs at all. So while just greens, yes, it has like it's a carb.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a fiber source without any starch, and it's not inflammatory. There's a huge difference when we're talking about using grains and starches and glutens. And I mean, that stuff is just so pro-inflammatory versus greens that are antioxidants and good fiber source for the microbiome. And just it's a huge difference.
Yeah, we need to use plants for what they're good at versus, there was kind of a movement in the holistic, not as much anymore, but there used to be a movement in the holistic side of things where plants were kind of a bad guy. And it's because we use plants wrong for so long. The main reason plants get used in the pet food industry is because they're cheap. So that's in the form of grains, and they're subsidized and that kind of thing. So, but if we're using plants for fiber, especially, one of the things I thought was super interesting about going to the last AHVMA conference, was Animal Biome's talk about what they've noticed in terms of raw fed dogs and not having, sufficient microbiome activity. And it's because most raw fed dogs don't have a diverse diet, and they don't have, especially a plant diverse diet. And that's kind of where we were like, oh, well, this is perfect for that, in regard to doing that. And so if we're using them for those antioxidants, for fiber, for vitamins and minerals versus, either that end of it or, there's, or say just a carb in the food itself to make up, a certain percentage of it, I think it'll be highly beneficial versus, detrimental to that.
Right. Yeah. So lots of things that we can do for our animals, but good healthy fats. And I think that so many people are so afraid to feed fats. People are so scared off by oh my gosh, it's gonna get pancreatitis. And I mean, the people at Keto Pet Sanctuary, when they had their original dogs that they were working with diet manipulation to see if a keto diet would work. When I did my first interview with them, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, they had dogs on 70% fat diets.
Mhm.
And one of my first questions was, oh my gosh, what do you do with all the pancreatitis? And they were like, we have not had a case of pancreatitis.
Mhm.
And it's because they're feeding raw fats and they're feeding what is appropriate for the dogs. And so I think people get so scared. My vet said it can't have more than 6% fat. And that's a crazy low number.
Well, and also, a lot of pancreatitis is due to the carbohydrate content. So
Exactly.
when you constantly inundate the pancreas with all of these carbohydrates and it's constantly stressed, the example I always bring up is the example, everyone brings up, which is my dog eats kibble. That's all he eats. And then at Thanksgiving, we got into some turkey fat and he went into pancreatitis. That's because at least newer research is showing us that is because the pancreas is constantly stressed every day with the high carbohydrate diet, and then you hit it with all this fat. So we're not seeing it nearly as much. It's possible in almost every case, right? Like there's nothing you can do to 100% say I'm never going to get this, but we're not seeing it as much when it's a low carbohydrate diet and a higher fat diet. In my last 12-ish years in the industry, I haven't really seen it in that capacity in terms of low carbohydrates and, higher fat diets.
I mean, it amazes me because I get emails from people saying, or I'll see it on social media, my dog's been on this low fat prescription diet for 2 years and yet keeps having, and I'm so strict, and keeps having bouts of pancreatitis. Like this is the 4th time this year the dog's been hospitalized. Wow. And it's like, yeah, that diet's not working, is it? Not working. Yes, you're being very strict. 6% fat. Your dog looks like poo. The coat's dry. The nose is dry. The pads are dry. They're not happy.
Well, and it's sort of ironic because it's also a high carbohydrate food.
Exactly.
So you're kind of feeding that. And the dehydration has a lot to do with it too, as well. And so, it's just tough to, I think, we all have to be willing to look at things that we've looked at for years and said, this is the reason. And when new evidence is presented, I think we all have to be able to say, I might have been wrong about this thing. And this is how we do it. That's exactly how science works, right? And so if you're unwilling to do that, then it's not necessarily science. It's a hard thing for humans to do, but
it is. But it's, my answer to people with that scenario is, well, clearly this isn't working.
Yeah.
Your dog keeps getting pancreatitis. This is not the solution. We have to come up with a different solution. But I understand that when you have that drilled into your head, can't have any fat, can't have any fat, can't have any fat, and that's all you've heard, and your dog's been hospitalized multiple times, it's really scary when you then switch to a fresh food diet and are told, yeah, look, we're going to have 20% fat in here. And, you get kind of a freak out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I will say too, this is my second plug. So we have 2 products that are sort of near and dear to my heart, one of which is Bam's Beets, and the other one is Lewis Fermented Golden Paste. And I think Bam's Beets is incredible as an everyday supplement for getting the immune system right. And what I mean by that is when we look at how the immune system functions in the gut, we look at what is the bacterial makeup of the gut itself. And so what we want to do is inoculate with as many different types of good bacteria. And so the coolest thing about those is they're wild fermented. So every time you use, a different batch of Bam's Beets, you're going to get a different set or varying amounts of different probiotics, because it depends on, it goes back down to the farm. So those beets were grown in soil. What animals were on that farm? What was the soil makeup of that? Because the bacteria are coming out of those vegetables, right? And they're soil based. But also on the cancer side as well, the bacteria eat all the sugar essentially. So there's basically no sugar. And I do want to address, because there's probably people watching this that are like, well, what about the histamines? The thing about histamines is there is a system in the body that gets rid of excess histamines. And unless you are on a MAOI medication, which inhibits that system, there hasn't really been any evidence that that's detrimental. So there's a difference between, say, histamines that come from the body from mast cell or something, and histamines in food. But also varying fermented foods have varying amounts of histamines anyway. So BAM's beets, I think, is a great preventative. And then with Lewis fermented golden paste, you have, again, those wild probiotics as well as kind of like a bonus. But that's great in terms of inflammation, because turmeric is a wonderful anti-inflammatory and also an antioxidant. And when it comes to cancer, pancreatitis, kidney disease, all of it is inflammatory. So that's a great sort of everyday there. And the crux of that one too is that instead of, most of the time that you add something to turmeric to make it more digestible, you're trying to keep it in the digestive tract longer so it can have time to absorb. And ours is totally different. The bacteria actually process the curcumin into metabolites. So it digests easier and much quicker. So we're actually trying to get it to absorb much faster as opposed to the other part. Because like if you were to eat turmeric, you'd have to turn it into metabolites as part of the step process. And the other part of that too is they fit together so well with our blends, because now you have a great source of wild-based probiotics and you can feed them with the blends. Because now you have the fiber. So those can both be a part of those cancer diets that we were talking about with low carbohydrates, because we're basically removing, they're fermented for 7 days. So we're removing basically all the sugar. So you're not adding any carbohydrates.
Awesome. All right. So happy World Cancer Day. Everybody keep your pets healthy and happy. I'm just enjoying sitting here by the fireplace because it is ridiculously cold.
Yes, I am as well.
We'll try to get back in and answer questions on all the different social media at some point.
Cool. Thank you, guys.